Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington, where we're getting new reaction from President Trump in an exclusive phone interview I had with him this afternoon after the stunning capture and arrest of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro this weekend, as the ousted leader made his first court appearance today. This was the scene this morning as Maduro was transported to federal court, surrounded by guards before being loaded into an armored truck. Maduro and his wife both pled not guilty to charges which include narco-terrorism, conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, and weapons charges. Maduro seeming defiant during court today, telling the court via a translator, quote, "I am still the president of my country." The president reacting to today's arraignment during my phone call with him, telling me, quote, "It is an extraordinary moment in history. That's true. And it's great for the hemisphere." He went on to say the prices of oil are going to, be reduced. The president also telling me we are not at war with Venezuela and that he would not need congressional approval to send in a second strike. One of the biggest questions right now is who is really in charge in Venezuela after President Trump said explicitly on Saturday that the U.S. would run the country. I asked the president about that today, if Secretaries Rubio and Hegseth, Stephen Miller would be the top three people in charge of Venezuela. The president said, yeah, among the top people, including J.D. Vance. I then asked him, who will be the top person if there is one? The president's answer to that question was me. Yesterday on Meet the Press, I also asked Secretary of State Marco Rubio about who's in charge. Here's what he said. Who are those people who will be running the country specifically?
Well, it's not running, it's running policy. The policy with regards to this. We want Venezuela to move in a certain direction because not only do we think it's good for the people of Venezuela, it's in our national interest. This is a team effort by the entire national security apparatus of our country, but it is running this policy. And the goal of the policy is to see changes in Venezuela that are beneficial to the United States.
But hours later, while speaking to reporters on Air Force One, President Trump offered a different view, doubling down on his statement that the U.S. will run Venezuela and seeming to threaten Venezuela's interim leader.
He said the U.S. would run Venezuela.
We're dealing with the people. We're dealing with the people that just got sworn in. And don't ask me who's in charge because I'll give you an answer and it'll be very controversial.
What does that mean?
It means we're in charge.
Can you just clarify where you stand on Delcy Rodriguez right now being in?
I don't have to tell you. I just say that she will face a situation probably worse than Maduro, because, Maduro gave up immediately.
But today, President Trump told me he thinks Delcy Rodriguez, who was sworn in today officially as Venezuela's interim leader, is cooperating with the United States, telling me, quote, "I do get the sense that they're cooperating. They need help. And I get the sense that, she loves her country and she wants her country to survive." Meanwhile, President Trump is now escalating his threats against countries beyond Venezuela, suggesting Sunday night that Cuba could be the next regime to fall, while also threatening that the U.S. could take action against several other countries, even those beyond the Western Hemisphere.
Cuba looks like it's ready to fall. I don't know how they're going to hold out.
Are you considering U.S. action in Cuba?
I think it's just going to fall. I don't think we need any action. It looks like it's going down. Colombia is very sick, too, run by a sick man who likes making cocaine and selling it to the United States, and he's not going to be doing it very long.
So there will be an operation by the U.S.
It sounds good to me. You have to do something with Mexico. Mexico has to get their act together because they're pouring through Mexico, and we're going to have to do something. We need Greenland from a national security situation. It's so strategic.
What would the justification be for a fleeing to Greenland? What would the justification
I don't want to talk about Greenland now. I just say this. We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security. And the European Union needs us to have it, and they know that.
There's been protesters killed in Iran. You said we were locked and loaded, ready to go. What is the line there for when the U.S. is going to get involved in those protests?
We'll take a look. We're watching it very closely. If they start killing people like they have in the past, I think they're going to get hit very hard by the United States.
And the president told me this afternoon he's, quote, very serious about needing Greenland for national security. Joining me now to start us off is NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba and NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel in Bogota, Colombia. Monica, let me start with you. President Trump saying that ultimately he's the one in charge of Venezuela. He did list some other names, Secretary Rubio, who I spoke with on Sunday, Secretary Hegseth, the Vice President Stephen Miller. He didn't indicate that there's a timeline by which he wants to see elections happen in Venezuela. What are your sources telling you inside the administration, Monica, about how this effort to take charge of Venezuela is unfolding?
Well, it's one thing, Kristen, to hear from sources inside the administration who maybe have a different answer, like what you saw on your own program yesterday, and then to have the president himself come out and tell you directly that he is the one who views himself as dictating this policy. And if it is like Secretary of State Marco Rubio says, that is going to be the role of the United States to really be setting the policy here and not necessarily, quote, running the country, the president seems to indicate that it will be him alongside these other top officials, perhaps the vice president, the deputy chief of staff, Stephen Miller, and others, trying to wrap their arms around the massive task of dictating what could come next. And I think that is incredibly significant that the president continues to lean in on that and not put any distance there, where we have seen, again, these top officials attempt to put a little bit of distance there and try to say that the United States isn't effectively going to be running the country. But I think it's really clear, Kristen, from conversations and the fast-moving developments of the last 2 days, that there is no clear timeline of just how this is going to work. Though the thing we have seen and gotten a little bit more information on is this idea that the president wants to be clear he is putting a lot of pressure on that interim leader who you just mentioned, Delcy Rodriguez. And though he wouldn't confirm to you that he necessarily spoke with her, we do know that Secretary Rubio, as he said, has been speaking with her and has been communicating with her. But remember that the sort of marker the president has put forward is that if he doesn't like what she does, what the interim leader and president now is doing in coordination with U.S. officials, he is talking and threatening this second wave or additional action. And it's just really unclear how long he's going to give her before we see a determination on that, Kristen.
And it's so fascinating, Monica. Secretary Rubio has really been one of the central figures so far in terms of this operation in Venezuela and the next steps. Obviously, he was the point person over the weekend. What are you hearing about his expanding role? And we know our colleagues, Andrea Mitchell, Abigail Williams, have been doing some reporting on this as well.
I mean, Secretary Rubio from the first Trump administration, when he was then Senator Marco Rubio, has been beating this drum. He has been very consistent. He has been very clear. And he has, in recent weeks and months, repeated the fact that he considered Nicolas Maduro an indicted drug trafficker, somebody who should face the full wrath of the United States. He would say that time and time again. He would be the one who is likely considered the loudest voice on this and saying that he really didn't consider Maduro to be a legitimate president and to essentially make him fair game for this, even though for months we had heard, Kristen, that the mission here wasn't going to be regime change. But Secretary Rubio is somebody who, in addition to his role, of course, as Secretary of State, as National Security Advisor, has clearly amassed a lot of influence in this particular sphere when it comes to Venezuela, when it comes to Latin America, and when it comes to Cuba. And I thought some of those other comments that the president made to you about what could come next for Cuba's future, clearly somebody behind the scenes there who is dictating and who is really, again, somebody who's had a lot of influence on the president and the administration overall there, is Secretary Rubio. And this is a space in which he has been very clear about what he would like to see happen next. And he was the one who delivered that warning over the weekend in the presser that if other world leaders are watching this, they should take note about what could happen to them next.
Monica Alba, thank you so much for your reporting from the White House. Fast-moving developments. Richard Engel, let me turn to you in the region there in Bogota. I spoke to President Trump about Colombia. I asked him, could that be the next country? He wouldn't answer directly, but made it very clear he's not pleased with the leadership in Colombia. What is the reaction there in the region so far, Richard? What are you hearing?
I'll start with Colombia. It could be that he was talking about the future political process for the president here, Gustavo Petro. He's not going to be in office very much longer. He faces elections in 3 months, and he can't run again. So there are no candidates here, even his opponents, who are calling on President Trump to intervene and to come and arrest him. This is a democracy. They held elections, and presidents are only allowed to run once. So if you've run and you've finished your term, you cannot run again. Hearing much more concern about the future of Cuba. That Cuba has perhaps never been weaker, that Cuba could be next on the list, that we might not see the same kind of snatch and grab operation that we saw in Venezuela. And I want to talk to you more about that. Very interesting that he says the new leader of the country, Delcy Rodriguez, is, in his opinion, cooperating just after he seemed to threaten her life earlier today, saying that she could face a worse fate than Nicolas Maduro if she doesn't cooperate, and a worse fate than being arrested could only be some sort of direct action. But in terms of Cuba, hearing and been working, talking to diplomatic sources, is that the idea or the hope is that Cuba will become weaker and weaker as it loses Venezuela, as it loses oil, as the people become more and more distressed, and that they could take matters into their own hands. And you saw President Trump, he said, what would tip the balance for the U.S. in Cuba is if the Cuban government starts to attack its own people, sort of suggesting that might be where he hopes that it's going, that if there is unrest, people take to the streets, there's some violent counter-reaction, we could see a different kind of regime change in Cuba. But what they're trying to do now, and I think this discrepancy is, President Trump, and you tell me, you're the one who had the conversation, says that he wants to run Venezuela and run it through his administration, with him making the ultimate big decisions, but that he doesn't want to govern the country. He doesn't want American troops on the ground going from village to village, dealing with the social problems, dealing with the Justice Department, but that he wants to govern the policy of the country. So govern it, no. But run the country, yes. It is a very slippery slope. No indications, no guarantees that this is going to work. There have been many attempts to impose policy that have not gone far. But it seems like regime change might be the word of 2026.
Yeah, Richard, you hit the nail on the head in the way that you characterize how President Trump seems to be viewing this. You're absolutely right. And I do think it is notable that he does not seem to, or at least he's not revealing what the timeline is that he has for the United States to be in charge in Venezuela. As you say, it is a very slippery slope. Talk a little bit about the dynamics at play there. The fact that you have this interim leader, Delcy Rodriguez, he says that Secretary Rubio speaks to her regularly in Spanish. She seems to be cooperating now, he says. As you note, that is a big shift in the wake of that threat. How do you see this evolving, Richard?
Well, there are also certain facts that I think cannot be ignored. The U.S. Special Forces went into the country, and they didn't really face ground fire. There was a little bit on one helicopter that was described, and there were dozens of Cubans that were killed. I've heard from sources over the last several months that Maduro's inner circle, his loyal guards who were loyal with him to the end, were Cubans, and that they were not in on any kind of deal. But the fact that there was no serious resistance, even as American helicopters were hovering over the country, I think does, over the capital, I think does speak volumes. Not only about the expertise and precision of U.S. Special Operations Forces, but about the mood in the country and perhaps its political future. Looking ahead, we haven't mentioned Iran very much. There are new protests in Iran. They've been turning deadly. It's a country I've been following closely for many years now, and I'm not sure if I've ever seen it in a weaker position.
Well, and Richard, of course, President Trump has threatened action in Iran. He says if innocent protesters are killed. Richard Engel, thank you so much, as always, for your great reporting. We really appreciate it.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.